My name is Laura, and I am an addiction advocate, is the best way I can put it. I am starting all of this in hopes of creating a platform to discuss addiction, discuss where it comes from, what causes it, the brain pathways, genetic links, as well as the many, many ways of recovery, societal implications, generational trauma, and family support. Um, and by that, I mean the support the family offers the loved ones, as well as the support for the family and the loved ones, right? Because it's difficult. Um, I also wanted to create a safe space for those who have lost someone to share their story. I think it gets lost sometimes. Um, Share their personality, the good, the bad, the quirks, the memories, the things about those people that might get missed when they're labeled an addict. I also want to invite those that are currently struggling or have struggled in the past or are working on recovery to share their story. I think that it's a great chance for us to shed some light in it. Um, Addiction is often buried because there's so much shame for everyone involved. Let's shed some light. Let's make these conversations loud, share our stories so society can see addicts as people and understand our loss and our struggles. That being said, a couple trigger warnings for today. We're going to talk about addiction, of course. I'm going to talk about uh, some animal death. You'll understand later. um, and I wanted one more trigger warning, and now I don't remember what it was. Maybe we'll catch it along the way. We'll figure this out, right? Okay, so when I did my episode on my sister, I talked a little bit about kind of how addiction happens and the parts of the brain and all of the hormones that go into it and all of that. And I said I wanted to go a little bit further into this. So that's kind of what today is. We want to kind of go into the parts of the brain and kind of what causes addiction and what keeps it going, basically. So there's two main theories that I kind of want to talk about. The one I'll just touch on, the other one is what I'll go more in depth in. And to preface this a little bit, the one I go more in depth in, which is the disease model, is the one that, based on my education, based on my experience in the field, based on my experience working with those with addiction issues, living with, loving and supporting those with addiction issues. This is the one that I see as the most, that makes the most sense, personally. So you may not agree, and that's okay. But that's the one that I see the most as, and I might do some episodes on some other theories, but that's the one that I find that makes the most sense to me based on, again, my experience and things like that. Also, I am human and I make mistakes, and I tell my kids that all the time, and I tell my clients that all the time. So I would be remiss if I did not say it here. So if I mess up, if I say something wrong, if I mix up some words or whatever, and please feel free to correct me and let me know, hey, no, that's not how that works. Please tell me. Because again, I am human and I make mistakes, and I'm happy to correct that. So all of that being said, let's jump into it. The first theory that I want to get into is the one that I'll touch on, which is one that I feel like comes up quite a bit, which is the choice theory. I think that's the one that we hear the most often, which is basically the concept of it's a choice, right? Addiction is a choice. We make these are behaviors, which means we can choose to act on them or not. We can choose to take a drink. We can choose not to take a drink. We can stop at any time. We should be able to make the right choice. That's the basic concept behind it, right? I'll be referencing a movie that I just think is so awesome. It's called Pleasure Unwoven by Kevin T. McCauley. and I apologize if I said that wrong. But it's one that I've shown clients on multiple occasions when I am teaching any kind of addiction education. I think that it breaks everything down really simply and beautifully. So if you ever want to spend like an hour and a half and just watch on addiction and understand it really well, I think it does a beautiful job. But he makes a comparison in there at one point of if you take an alcoholic and you put a shot of whiskey in front of him and you put a gun to his head and you say, okay, if you take this drink, I'll shoot you in the head, right? The concept is that, well, if I do that, that they'll likely not drink, which, I mean, chances are they probably won't, right? They will choose not to take that drink. And that's kind of where a lot of people get that choice model. And that's where a lot of times we're able to kind of buy into that is like, well, they made this choice not to do that. But what it misses a lot of times is what's going on in the brain and what they're thinking at that time, which often is not always a choice. Our thoughts kind of come naturally without us often realizing it. That's where things change. So that being said, here's the choice model, the very basics of it, and I'll reference that here and there. But the next, what we're going to jump into is the disease model. So when anybody who remembers any kind of history when it comes to diseases and medical conditions and that remembers, a lot of times we talk about back in the day when doctors were first becoming a thing and all of that, when we used to drill holes in people's heads and they had headaches, and we used to use leeches, which interestingly enough we still do. But a lot of times we were just trying to figure out how to make somebody feel better. That was the main concept. We were looking at symptoms. We were looking at, oh, they have this pain in their head. How can we fix the pain in their head, right? Same with things a lot more complex, like diabetes, right? So when people started showing symptoms, and I'm sure this probably existed, I can't say it just all of a sudden showed up in like the 1800s, right? I'm sure it existed a long time before that. I'm not a medical professional. I'm a mental health professional, so I can't tell you when it showed up. But I can say that it probably showed up a long time ago. But the point is, we originally started treating the symptoms. So anybody who's ever dealt with a diabetes, it does run in my family, so I know a little bit more about it, but it comes with like increased urination, increase in thirst, sometimes weight loss, blurry vision, numbness and tingling in the hands and feet, dry skin, fatigue, all that funky stuff, right? But these are a lot of symptoms that sometimes seem very disconnected, right? They don't make a whole lot of sense because they seem like they don't go together. And so we were often treating these separate symptoms. We're like, oh, well, they're peeing a lot more. What does that mean, right? Like, well, maybe they need to drink less, right? But also it came with an increased thirst. And so we're like, oh, well, maybe they need to drink more, which also caused its own issues, right? Weight loss, oh, well, maybe they need to eat more, right? What's going on there? Blurry vision, well, we need to fix the vision. Numbness and tingling in the feet, well, where does that come from? I got to figure that out. Dry skin, well, let's give them some lotion, right? Fatigue, well, maybe they need to sleep more. And so we're treating all of these symptoms, but we're treating them at the very symptom level, right? They're fatigue, so sleep more. Very basic level. Then we start looking at how do we, let me back up. So then at some point, medical professionals started going, we're treating all of these symptoms, and this person has so many things going on. Maybe we're not really treating the actual problem, right? So maybe we're missing something. And that's kind of when they started looking at, well, maybe it's something deeper. Maybe there's a defect somewhere in the body that we're missing. And so that's when they started looking at where could that defect be coming from, and where in the body is the problem. But at some point they realized there's these symptoms that are just coming from so many different places, right? And they're like, well, we're treating a bunch of symptoms and this person has so many. So where are all of these symptoms coming from? And at some point, somebody in their super large brains and their super smart minds went, well, maybe there's something else going on. Maybe there's an organ in there causing a problem. And if there's an organ, then maybe there's a defect in the organ. And if that's the case, then we need to figure out what that is, and start working towards that. I couldn't even begin to tell you how they figured out it was the pancreas and that it was insulin. I don't know. Whoever that was, kudos. And it's probably in the research somewhere, so I apologize for that. But it wasn't me. Great job. Because it's helped a lot of people. But the basic idea for our information here is that basically realized all of these symptoms were coming from one organ with a defect. So one organ, which is the pancreas, has a defect, which means it's struggling to produce insulin the way that it needs to produce it, which is causing all of these symptoms, which are the issues with urination, increased thirst, we got there, weight loss, blurry vision, numbness, tingling, dry skin, fatigue, and oh my gosh, a whole host of so many other symptoms, right? And that helped them to be able to then attack the situation from the source, right? Which is kind of how everybody does things, right? When we look at something, it's like, well, if there's a problem going on, the best way to solve the problem is to go all the way back to the source. If we're trying to stop a flood, right? Continuing to try and just soar up the water. I don't think that's the word I'm looking for. I don't think it is. If we're trying to stop the flow of water at the bottom of the flood, that's only going to do so much, right? Because the water is going to keep coming. Best option we have is to go to where the source of the flood is coming from, which could be a broken dam or what have you, right? And so the best option we have is to go to the source and fix that, because eventually then it will stop the flood. So that's where that came from. And that's what most medical professionals use to figure out where a problem is coming from in our bodies. Now, keep in mind, the brain is also an organ, and it can have defects, right? It can overproduce and underproduce hormones. It can overreact to things and underreact to things. Those of us that have migraines are well aware of this, right? So it still has the ability to have these same issues. So keep in mind that there is a possibility of defects within the brain which cause symptoms. So basically, with that in mind, the fact that the brain is an organ, we can look at, to start things off at least, substance use and addiction in that term. So we've got an organ, which is the brain. There's a defect in it, which is generally with hormones and the pleasure centers, which I'll get into, and memories and stress levels, things like that. And the symptoms are usually triggers and cravings and all of the other symptoms that we see, which is oftentimes personality changes, decision-making struggles, and personality changes, decision-making struggles, issues with the law, legal system. I would include all of that into the symptoms because it does show up, right? I mean, that they're kind of more societal symptoms, but I personally include them in there because I feel like they kind of catch. So keeping all of that in mind, we're going to do another little history lesson. So if we go back to about the 1960s, the federal government defunded mental institutions. And there's a lot of different theories and different information we get on why they did this. Some of it was because they felt like they were unsafe and they weren't helpful, which, oh heavens, they were not. If if anybody wants me to do an episode on that, I will gladly do an episode on that. It's not pretty, but good for us to know. But nevertheless, whatever their reasoning and thought process was, the defunding happened, which placed a lot of folks without care. And that included folks who had serious mental illness, who had neurodevelopmental issues. That includes those with like level 2, level 3 autism, what we used to call low functioning. It also those with like Down syndrome, things like that, where they needed a place to be that would take care of them, no longer existed, as well as those who had severe trauma and unable to function in society. So they were left without a place for care. This placed care requirements on families, homeless shelters, and essentially the general population. We had people roaming the streets, people who had no families that were stuck with homeless shelters that were overflowing. Flowing words are struggling today. We're going to get there. Or overflowing, often without medications, right? So I can't say that the meds in the 1960s were perfect, right? I mean, we were running off of what we would call a lot of the old school stuff nowadays. But I mean, at least meds were meds, right? We had something. They were on something to at least help. So at this point, they were off their meds. They were without any kind of structure, support, help. Again, mental institutions were not great back then either. So again, it wasn't super great, but at least it was something with people who had better training than the general population, which kind of left. I don't want to say left, but it caused issues in the fact that those with these struggles didn't know how to handle things, didn't know how to live in society, or how to handle things within society, or weren't able to. Either they didn't know how or they weren't able to. And so, unfortunately, it came with a lot of quote unquote crime, right? Theft, assaults, domestic violence, things like that came of this. Obviously, things happen when we don't have the support mentally and emotionally that we need. So the outcome of that was that we had to find somewhere for these folks to go when they're committing crimes. And what's the outcome? The next institution available, which was correctional institutions. They kind of became the de facto mental health at that point because we didn't have mental health institutions to send these people to. So I apologize. I shouldn't say these people because I don't like that, because I have mental health issues as well. But we didn't have mental health institutions to send folks with mental health issues to. So the next best thing, which wasn't really a great thing, but next best thing was correctional institutions. So that burden was then placed upon jails and prisons who weren't trained, didn't have the support for it or the structure to take care of it. And all we ended up doing was basically creating a revolving door. And this also then creates a feeling within society that if we have a mental health issue and these symptoms come up of it, which can be, again, aggression, assault, theft, things like that, then that is a behavior that can be stopped. Which then we shift this mindset of let's heal and treat and help to more of a thought process of correction and punish and fix. And those are two very different ways of thinking. Now, when we start to, if we do take a step back and look more at the disease model of things, that's when we can kind of look at it as these are not necessarily behaviors, but maybe symptoms, like I said before, right? But with the choice model, we're looking at it and saying, well, okay, if a person has these outcomes of a decision, right? So if we have, so when we had correction institutions, it changed society's view from help, treat, and support to more of punish and fix. And that was kind of society's change in the view there. And we start to see some of these actions from mental health, including substance use disorders, which are part of mental health, as behaviors. And we think that if we correct a behavior, people will change, right? So best way I can describe this is if we've got a 5 or 6-year-old who steals a candy bar out of the pantry, we think, okay, if I put him in timeout, excuse me, drink too much coffee. If we put him in timeout, then they will learn that that's not okay, right? We've punished them, we've corrected the action, we've explained we don't steal, right? And that works great, depending upon your parenting views, if the issue is that the child just didn't understand that stealing is bad, and they're just like, oh, I see candy, I want candy, I'm going to take the candy, and they didn't think, oh, well, maybe I actually stole something, and that's not okay, right? So that might work if their understanding is that, versus, and we can take that as a choice model of like, well, they made a choice, we can correct the choice, versus if we look at it in terms of the disease model of there might be something underlying that's causing this behavior. So say the child steals a candy bar, but it's not because they didn't understand that stealing is bad. Maybe they do understand that stealing is bad. However, maybe they have undiagnosed hypoglycemia or diabetes or something, and their body is telling them, I need sugar right now. And because they're 5 and 6, they don't know how to explain that feeling. So they take the candy bar. They take the candy bar. At some point we'll get words, right? They take the candy bar, they eat it, and they feel better, right? If we put them in timeout, all they're going to sit there and do is wonder, why am I in trouble for doing something that my body told me to do, right? So there's an organ, which could be the pancreas or the thyroid or whatever is involved in those sugar situation, and there's a defect there, and their body's trying to fix it, which is those symptoms of low or high blood sugar or whatever's going wrong, and they're trying to fix the situation. And so they do what they think is going to solve the problem, which is get the candy bar, eat the candy bar. No amount of timeouts or whatever is going to fix that problem. It might keep them from stealing the candy bar, but they're just going to find another way to get that sugar. If that means that they take a handful of sugar from the sugar bowl, or they stop asking for help and they get sicker and sicker, right? It doesn't change. It might change the behavior to some degree. They might not steal a candy bar again, but it doesn't change the fact that the problem still exists, and they're going to find another way to solve the problem in some degree. We haven't fixed the defect in whatever organ is causing the problem. There's the difference between the two models, and how they don't really work within the correction system. Because if it is just a basic behavior, right, if it's just theft is bad, then maybe sending them to prison might fix that, right? Or jail or whatever the sentence is, that might fix it. If it's because they have neurodevelopmental issues and they don't understand that stealing is bad, and no amount of going to jail or prison is going to help them understand that stealing is bad, they're just going to try and find a different way to go about it, or they're just going to continue to do it because there is no chance of changing that concept. So this is where we get into some of these symptoms that are not really seen, right? So triggers and cravings. So our body, in the scenario of the 5 or 6-year-old, they were craving sugar. Their body's telling them, I need sugar, and I need sugar right now. They don't really know why. They don't really understand why. They just know I really, really, really need the sugar. So they're going to do whatever it takes to get the sugar. That's craving, right? Triggers are anything that kicks it off, right? And a lot of times those are things that remind them of something that works, right? It might be that they've always, or not always, but maybe they've had this issue for the last couple of months and they just don't feel good, but they know that anytime mom gives them cake, they feel better. And so they smell something that reminds them of cake and it's like, oh yeah, that makes me feel better. I'm going to go get the cake. So it triggers a memory in their brain that makes them like, oh, that's going to work. Or they start to feel a little bit tired and they're like, and that's a trigger. They're like, oh, when I feel tired, I know I get worse. And I know that when I drink chocolate milk, it makes me feel better. So I'm going to go find something that's a lot of sugar, right? Triggers. It reminds them of a time when they didn't feel good and helps them remember a time that helped them feel better, something that helped them feel better in that time. They're going to do whatever it takes to feel better. Difference between triggers and cravings. This is when we can also go back to the whole gun to the head alcoholic argument too. When we're saying put a shot of whiskey in front of an alcoholic, put a gun to his head and say, you know, if you take a drink, I'll shoot you. They might make the choice, right? They're going to change their behaviors in that very moment and probably not take a drink. But it does not change what's going on in their head, which is where those triggers and cravings come in. You just put a shot of whiskey in front of an alcoholic. That's an automatic craving. Anybody who's ever had substance use issues, anybody who's ever had trouble with alcohol knows the second they see that, it's triggered, right? So their brain's going off going, oh man, I really want that drink. That would make me feel so much better. I can just imagine how much better I'd feel. Oh, I wonder if I can get that alcohol into my brain before the bullet gets into my brain. They might change their behavior in that moment, but it doesn't change the thoughts that go through their head. It does not change the triggers. It does not change the trigger, and it does not change the craving for the alcohol once it's seen. That's where those two change, okay? And those are the symptoms we need to be aware of, those triggers and cravings, because those are going on in your head. You can't, there's really no way to change those. Those are there. The triggers are going to be there. All we can do is learn to cope with them and try to avoid them is the best way that I can put it. Now, how does our brain connect these and where do these come from? And why does our brain go, oh, chocolate milk's going to make me better? Now we get into hormones. We're going to describe a couple here, so just keep in mind a couple of names. We've got dopamine, glutamate, and cortisol. A couple of those you've probably heard of. The glutamate, maybe not so much. Dopamine is what we call the pleasure or the happiness hormone. Glutamate is for memory, and cortisol generally comes from stress. And I know a lot of us probably heard that one when we talk about weight loss, weight gain, things like that, because we're like, oh, if we have a lot of cortisol, that causes us to gain weight. Medical professionals, I just know that comes up a lot. So dopamine is a really fun little chemical that pops up anytime anything is pleasurable, good, or more importantly, better than expected. And this is for our survival. It helps us remember things that we know will be helpful in the future if we need them to survive. Kind of like, again, the child with possibly diabetes, hypoglycemia, like we were talking about. If sugar is a really great example. Sugar is something that that hits our dopamine sensors. I think I tried to combine sensors and centers. Sensors really well. And it's because sugar is a great way to boost up our energy. It helps keep our blood sugars well, right? And there's a lot of it, but words. Sugar is a great source of energy for us. So our mind's going to remember sugar. Not long-lasting energy, but it's energy. So our brain's going to go, oh, chocolate cake, that's a lot of sugar. And it's going to lock that away, right? So, and it's going to kick in that dopamine and like just shoot it up because it's like, we need to lock this in. So another example that I love that they use in the movie, Pleasure Unwoven, go up to a gumball machine and you put in a quarter and you get 2 gumballs instead of 1. Okay. And you're like, and your brain goes, oh my God, I got 2 gumballs. It's amazing. I was only supposed to get 1. This is awesome. Let's remember that gumball machine because that is the best gumball machine in the world because it gave me 2. Okay. And you know what your brain's going to do? It's going to tell you, let's try that again. See if we can't get 2 again. So you put in another quarter. This time you get 1. I mean, it's still awesome. You still got a gumball, which is great. And so your brain's going to go, I still got a gumball. Wasn't the 2 I wanted, but still great. And then let's say you put in another one, and this time you get 0 gumballs, right? And this time you get like, your dopamine's like, the fuck? Like, I didn't get anything. What the hell? But it's still going to kick, but you still got a dopamine surge, which basically kicked in to be like, look, this was better than expected. I got 2 gumballs. This is awesome. This is great. And your brain's going to remember that. And it remembers that because it kicks glutamate in, which is for memory. And so dopamine goes, this was awesome. This is important. This is helpful. This will probably be good for survival. Glutamate goes, cool, great. I'll remember that. And the 2 connect so that in the future, you go walking by that gumball machine and you're like, oh yeah, that one gave me 2 once. I wonder if I should try it again. Seems simple, but that's how our brain works. Now, this works the same way for addiction. I described a little bit about this in my episode about my sister, where when we have great surges of dopamine, our cortisol works to keep our body in some kind of homeostasis. And I'm going to use some numbers just to make this as easy to understand as possible. They're not actual numbers. Bear with me. So if we have our body, if our body likes to set it like 150, it thinks that's a general happy good basis number for dopamine and cortisol living in our body, and we're happy, we're content, we're good, right? Something good happens and we get a surge of dopamine, right? And it jumps us out to like 200. It's like, this is good. I'm feeling happy. I'm feeling good. And that could be like, we get an A on a paper, child's dance recital, something cool happens, right? And then something really great, like we go on a vacation, could get us up to like 250, right? It's like, yay, things are great. Okay. And we remember that vacation. So that one's going to really lock in our memory, right? Because it's like super awesome greatness. Okay. Now, if we have something that messes with these things, like alcohol, drugs, things like that, that have an impact on that, like if we take a shot of heroin, meth, things like that, it's going to surge our dopamine up a lot because it's like, this is super great. Oh my gosh, I feel so high. I feel so happy. I feel so calm. I feel so good. I feel so wonderful. And it's going to surge that dopamine. And we went from like the normal 150 to like 350 over a course of like seconds. And we're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And our dopamine's like, holy crap, I feel amazing. This is wonderful. Glutamate, you better remember this. And it does its thing, right? And eventually, the dopamine will go back down. Problem is, we always want to seek that back out. It's one of the reasons why we go back to the gumball machine with 2 gumballs. We always want to go back and try and feel that again. It's because our dopamine's like, that's helpful. That was good. That was probably good for our survival. We probably want to keep doing this because it'll probably help us in the future. Usually these things are connected to the things that are basic for survival: eating, sleeping, and sex. Because sex procreates, right? That's why we have orgasms. It's facts. Okay. This is why we keep having sex, because it feels good. Okay. If it didn't feel good, we probably wouldn't do it. Let's be honest. It's also why food needs to taste good, because if it didn't feel good, I mean, we'd probably eat, but would we really enjoy it? No. And that's the whole point. Okay. So dopamine's like, if it feels that good, it's probably connected to our survival in some way. And so if I got 2 gumballs, then maybe this is something really good and it's something important and something I need to go back to get. Again, if this drug is giving me such a huge hit of dopamine, then it must be super important and I must go back and try it again because it's got to be connected to my survival in some way. So we keep trying to go back. But the problem is it never hits the same, because it's never the same as the first time. Just like sex is never the same as the first time with anybody. It's just not. The first time you try the most amazing chocolate cake, right? Like it's the best chocolate cake in the entire world. You go back and try it again, it's never the exact same, right? It's just not. So we don't ever get the exact same hit. So our body's constantly going to try and get that same hit. And eventually, most of the time, our dopamine does drop back down, right? It has a surge and it goes back down. Our cortisol, if it doesn't go back down immediately, our cortisol will try to raise a little bit to meet it, right? It's like, okay, well, we're getting a little bit too hyper. Maybe we need to kind of come back down so that we're a little bit level, right? This is why bipolar is so stressful, because we're super manic or we're super depressed. This is not great for our system. It messes with our system. It messes with our ability to function. So we need to kind of stay in a fairly stable point. So our cortisol is going to kind of come up where it needs to meet that dopamine so that they can kind of even each other out and kind of come back down. Problem is, at some point, if we keep using or we keep doing these things that cause huge dopamine surges, right? Like the usual things, like I said, getting an A on a paper, whatever, that's 50. That's easy to bring back down. It'll come back down eventually. Both will kind of drop over time. If we're doing things that are jumping us up to a 350 over and over again, or because that is not going to be 350 every time, but 350, then 345, then 340, right? But we're consistently jumping these numbers up and down. Eventually, cortisol is going to be like, oh my gosh, this is messing with the system. We need to do something to keep this somewhat homeostatic. And so it's going to change from 150 to maybe 300. And so now your cortisol is sitting at 300 rather than 150, because it's like, we need to stay homeostatic to some degree. Problem with that is now anything that was a dopamine hit before doesn't register anymore because cortisol is canceling it out. You have so much cortisol level, the dopamine doesn't hit anymore. It doesn't even register. An A on a paper, a child's dance recital, even a trip to the freaking amusement park isn't going to hit anymore because you're way above that. You're sitting at such a high level, you can't even feel it. And I'll talk about pause in a future episode, but that's kind of where a lot of people get into what they call anhedonia, which is where they don't feel anything, which is not great. So the basic concept is we feel something great. We're like, this is connected to survival. This has got to be awesome. Glutamate, remember this. So they do. And then if it stays too high, cortisol is going to try and, balance it back out. And if we're sitting too high, we can't feel the basic joys anymore. And also, at some point, cortisol is probably sitting at that 300. At some point, even the drugs aren't going to hit that anymore. Because like I said, over time, it's going to go from 2 gumballs to 1 gumball to 0 gumballs. And then even the drugs are hitting at 200. But the cortisol is still sitting too high because it hasn't figured it out yet. Because this happens over time. It doesn't happen immediately. So it takes a while for cortisol to figure out it needs to calm back down. And in the process, you've built up this tolerance to this drug and you're trying to just match it. And so, but you're so worried about trying to match it that before cortisol can figure it out and calm back down, you've increased your use, right? You've gone from a gram to 2 to 3 to 4. You've gone from 4 shots of whiskey to a bottle because you're like, I got to feel the same amount. The only way to feel the same amount is to get more, right? You're like, well, I'm getting 0 gumballs now, so I got to figure out a way to get 2 gumballs. So I'm going to go to every gumball machine in lower Manhattan until I find the gumballs I need to feel the dopamine surge I did before. I'm hoping some of this is making sense. It's giving that aha moment of, oh, that makes sense. This is why they keep doing this. We go back. This is also where a lot of people with trauma will come in and use drugs, as I said before, because maybe their cortisol levels are too high. If they're dealing with a lot of trauma and a lot of stress all the time, their cortisol levels are sitting high. This works in reverse, right? So their cortisol levels are sitting at 300 because their life is insanity all the time. Then things like an A on a paper or going to the amusement park isn't going to hit. It's not really going to make a difference. For most people, that would be like, woohoo, this is awesome. For those folks, it's not going to feel like much. So to feel anything, you've got to find something that's going to hit a 350 on the meter, which can include drugs, unsafe sex, things like that, that is like, this is so crazy and wild and out of the ordinary that it does hit the survival meter. It does hit the dopamine meter. And that's where addiction comes in, because it's like, oh, I finally felt this. This is amazing. And now I'm going to continue to do whatever I have to do to feel it. And also addiction causes stress because we come away with legal issues and relationship issues and we lose all of these things. And then we're left with more stress, which then means, oh, well, now I need to use more to feel more. It's a lovely little cycle. And it sucks. The correctional institutions come in where we see the behaviors and we think they're losing their homes and their families, they're going to jail, and we think, okay, well, if we tell them, you steal money or you sell drugs, that's bad, don't do that again, we send them to jail and they get back out. But now we've caused higher cortisol. Well, the situation has caused higher cortisol levels. How do you think they're going to solve that to feel anything? They're going to go back to the drug. They're going to want to feel joy. Because it takes time for that cortisol to drop, and they're going to want to feel joy somewhere in there. And if just the basics aren't going to cut it, they're going to want to feel joy, and they're going to do whatever it takes to feel that joy. And this is also how things get mixed up, right? And like I said, dopamine is meant for survival. And over time, because the cortisol is so high, and things that are usually meant for survival, simple things like food, chocolate cake, sex, sleeping, all of those things that are normally meant for survival don't hit the meter anymore because our cortisol is so high and dopamine needs to be much higher. Those things literally don't hit the meter, and our brain honestly thinks they are not for survival anymore. Our brain starts to think the only thing that counts for survival is this drug, because that's the only thing that hits that dopamine meter. It's the only thing we feel anything for. So at that point, every other survival thing, anything else goes right out the window. It's gone. And that's why they're willing to give up their families, their lives, their homes, their jobs, their freedom, everything. Because all of those things no longer count towards survival or life or importance of any sort. It is all about that drug, because that is the only thing that hits it. It's also where things like our decision making goes out the window, because we're humans and we have this lovely little brain where we have these parts of our brain, the frontal parts of our brain, which is where our personality is, our decision making, our empathy, most of our like higher emotions, things like that exist, right? This is where we're able to form relationships, be creative, kind of come up with our lives, have motivation, those kinds of things. This is where that exists, is up in this frontal part of our brain. When survival mode kicks in, like fight or flight, things like that, it is back in our midbrain or our reptile brain, our basic simple system that most animals survive off of, which is eating, sleeping, sex. Again, basic. Okay, eating, sleeping, sex, and not die. Okay, that's where the basics are, right? So once we're in survival mode, that is it. This frontal part of our brain essentially either shuts off completely or drops very, very low. So our decision making is either non-existent or it is completely based around survival. And by that I mean it is very, very, it is not thinking, oh, I just lost, oh, there we go. It is not thinking, I have money, I should put it towards my car payment, my house payment, groceries, the things, all of that, because that is logic and that's higher decision making. It is thinking, I have money, drugs, because that is the only thing that matters. Food doesn't matter. Housing doesn't matter. Those are not important. It is also it is also not thinking relationships are important. It's not caring that stealing money from your grandmother is going to hurt her feelings, right? Because if we think about the animal, the tiger, it doesn't care that if it kills the antelope's baby, the antelope's mommy's going to be sad. It doesn't care. It just wants food, right? Basics. There's no empathy there. Uh, Again, like basic decision making. If there's a bear in the corner, we're not thinking, oh, that bear, I should maybe do this or maybe do that, or I should look at its eyes and its claws and it's this and it's that. It's just all of these thoughts just go in, bear, scared, run. It's very basic decision making skills. Anything that makes us who we are goes out the window. And I've said this a million times and I'll say it till the day I die. The addict in the middle of their use is a completely different person than who they are when they're sober. Anybody who's ever loved an addict can absolutely agree with that statement, because they can look at the personality and know they are a completely different person. They don't care the same, they don't act the same, they don't sound the same, because they are in survival mode. And the things that they are willing to do in that survival mode are so different than the things that they are and are not willing to do when they're not. And that is important to remember, because it's not them. It's not them, because their personality is up here in the frontal lobe. It's up here. And that's not the part that's on right now. That's the part that's turned off. It's dimmed down. It's not even paying attention right now. That personality, that person that you love, it's quiet right now, unfortunately. And it's something to keep in mind. They did a study on rodents, and this is why I said trigger warning for animal death. And the animal activists are going to hate this, but it was a study, and I feel it's important to keep in mind. On rats and cocaine and pleasure centers. So they took rats and they basically hooked it up so that if they push this little button, it would set off that pleasure center in their brain, basically like a mini orgasm. Okay. And they still had everything else. They had their little rat buddies, and they had food, and they had water, and all the things, right? So they had the ability to choose, right? But once that pleasure center was set off, this little rat friend would go in there and just push the button and push the button and push the button and push the button and push the button. And they would push it until they literally starved to death. Okay. They were willing to give up everything else. Rat friendship, relationships, procreation, food, water, whatever else. They were literally willing to give up all of this if it meant they could continue to push that button. They even went one step further, and again, I'm sorry for the little rat buddies, where they set it up to where they could stand, they were standing, in order to push the button, they had to stand on this shock plate, where it would literally shock them, okay? Like electrical shock. And every time they pushed the button, it would shock them, as well as set off this pleasure center. They would still do it. And they would literally shock themselves, electrocute themselves to death if it set off this shock plate. This is why people will use to the point of overdosing. This is why people will this is why people will continue to drink when their liver is shot. This is why people will continue to use meth when their teeth are rotting out of their head. Because that doesn't matter. They will literally don't care. This is now survival. Living isn't even survival. This drug is survival. It's insanity what the brain will do. And that's why people look at it and they're like, this is a choice. You have a choice. This rat had a choice to step off the freaking plate, but it didn't. Humans have these choices to make, but they don't, because their brain is so confused and it thinks this is the only way to survive, that you are convinced that I have to give up literally everything else in my life, including my life, to obtain this drug. And I think that's the easiest way to understand it, and it also makes it really hard. because you're like, why can't you just stop? And again, coming from somebody who's lost more than one person to this, it is really hard to understand that part. When they are literally killing themselves and they can't stop. I know that was a lot of information. But I have to say, explaining that has become a passion of mine in and of itself, because I feel like to some degree it takes away some of the shame for those who suffer with it. And it takes away some of the shame from the family. And it's so helpful when someone who has suffered with it for years, decades even, and doesn't understand, why can't I stop? Why, when I get triggered, am I back here? Why, when I crave it, am I back here? And why do I keep craving it when I know it's something that's not going to help me? But I keep craving it. And I'm still back here in jail or treatment for the 5th time. I don't understand. And they finally hear this explanation and they go, oh my God, that makes sense. I understand. Like, the light bulb that goes off in their heads and the weight that is lifted for them to go, okay. And I know I'll get some comments of, oh, well, that's just a way for them to find an excuse. And I won't lie, some do. Some are like, well, it's a brain disease. I don't have I'm not responsible for that. It doesn't mean we're not responsible for our decisions. We're still responsible. The rat was still responsible for getting shocked, right? It's an animal. Again, they don't have the frontal brain like we do, but we're still responsible for the choices that we make. But the things that go on in our brain that make it difficult to make those decisions, the knowledge of why that is can make such a difference. One of the things that pretty much every mental health professional will tell you that makes the biggest difference in change is awareness. If we do not know why we act the way we do, if we do not know what is causing that, we can't change it. Just like the disease model, organ defect symptom. If we don't understand where the symptoms are coming from and what they are, we can treat all of the symptoms as much as we want. We can try to fix the symptoms as much as we want. But if we don't know where what organ's causing what defects and what is going on, we can't fix it. But if we can step back and go, oh, my brain is struggling with these hormones, and it's all messed up because it thinks this is survival and it's not, then I can step back and be like, when I get that craving, I step back and be like, no, that's not survival. This is survival. And you can start arguing with your brain a little bit. That's when you can start making change. Just like any other mental health issue. I have ADHD and I'm still responsible when I forget stuff. But knowing that I have it, I can have coping skills to go along with it. I can make sure things are out in the open, because if they are not, to me, they have disappeared into the cosmos. But I know that, and I can work with my brain and how it does its thing. Just like we really haven't found a cure for diabetes. We can't fix it right now, but we at least know what's going on with the insulin, and so we can try to help the pancreas do what it needs to do correctly to help with some of those symptoms. Same deal. And again, this is to help with the shame. This podcast is called A Family Addiction because it runs in families, and because it becomes an addiction within the family and a tradition within the family a lot of times to hide these things because there is so much shame. It's a societal issue. And my hope is that we can open it up a little bit, shed some light, and work on banishing that shame and allowing ourselves to release some of that burden when we learn a little bit about it. So I welcome you to please share your stories, share your experiences, suggest topics that you think would be helpful for me to cover for society to understand this, for you to understand it. Is there something that you feel like if you'd known that would have made a difference in how you helped or didn't help your loved one, or how you feel like people could have helped you? This is an important topic that isn't touched on nearly as much as it should be. And as I said before, I know that if I had had some of this information going into my adult years, I think it would have changed some of the outcomes. I can't say it would have changed all of them, but I know it would have changed some of them. So let's share our stories. Let's share them loud. Let's make this a conversation. Thank you.